Welcome to my series of basketball videos where I'll be comparing various NBA greats against each other. I'm doing this because I find that a lot of the basketball videos comparing players on YouTube are too focused on the big names and sometimes compare players from different positions. Lots of people compare Jordan to LeBron and Kobe to Duncan, for example, due to their similar levels of achievements, but since those players play different positions and have different styles of play, it's not an interesting comparison. In this series, I want to do comparisons between not just more well-known players, but players from days past, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and the ABA as well, that most modern fans probably do not have too much knowledge about. Also, as much as possible, I want to compare players that play similar positions and/or similar play styles. To me, that's a more interesting and fruitful comparison. I'll be using 8 different metrics to judge each player. Scoring. This category will be defined by each player's career points per game, peak points per game, both regular season and playoffs, and number of scoring titles. Rebounding. This category will be defined by each player's career rebounds per game, peak rebounds per game, both regular season and playoffs, and number of rebounding titles. Passing. This category will be defined by each player's career assists per game, peak assists per game, both in regular season and playoffs, and number of assist titles. Efficiency advanced metrics. This category will be defined by each player's career true shooting percentage, PER, and win shares per 48. Reason I use true shooting percentage is because it's more fair to guards. Defense. This category will be defined by each player's all defensive selections, defensive win shares, and defensive player of the year awards. The reason I'm not using blocks, steals, or defensive box plus minus is because I want to compare the achievements of older players that modern fans might not have too much knowledge about, and players in the 1960s and early 1970s do not have these stats tracked. Awards. This category will be defined by all-star appearances, all-NBA selections, MVPs, finals MVPs, and championships as a top 3 player. The reason I have to count championships as a top 3 player on the team is because otherwise you'll get into the situation where, for example, Robert Horry has 7 rings and Karl Malone has 0, and it's not representative of how much better a player is if you weren't a top 3 player on that team contributing to a championship. Also, I'll be including ABA stats and awards and using them equivalent to their respective NBA stats and awards. Also, no All-NBA third team selections are included because All-NBA third teams weren't added until the late 1980s, which is unfair to older players. Playoffs. This category will be defined by how many Eastern Conference Finals or Western Conference Finals and Finals a player has been to, and how many championships they won as a top 3 player on the team. Yes, this is supplementary to the awards category because it also rewards players for making it far in the playoffs, even if they don't necessarily win at all. Totals. This category will be defined by longevity, how many total points, rebounds, assists, and win shares a player has accumulated throughout their career, and rewards a player's durability. After all, a lot of people say the best ability is availability. And of course, this is only going to be my opinion from comparing the available metrics, since I've not watched most of these players live or even been born when some of these players have been playing. And to keep it fair, I'm judging them based on how they did in their own era. There's no comparing what this NBA player played in today's era or the 1960s, none of that. It'll be strictly based on their stats and accomplishments within their own era against that era's competition, which makes the most sense to me. So I hope you guys enjoy this comparison video and hopefully learn something new from it. In the 39th episode of the series, we'll take a look at 2 swingman players who could play both shooting guard and small forward and were the premier scorers for their franchises at their peak. Walter Davis, nicknamed Greyhound, is not well remembered today, but he was a steady scorer for the Phoenix Suns during the 1970s and 1980s, retiring as their all-time leader in points, which is a record he still holds to this day. Chris Mullin is a bit more well-known, playing his prime in the 1990s, mostly with the Golden State Warriors, serving as part of the Run TMC roster alongside Mitch Richmond and Tim Hardaway, and then later in his career coming off the bench for the Reggie Miller-led Indiana Pacers. So who had the greater career? Let's find out. In the scoring category, this is what both players were known for. Davis averaged 18.9 points per game for his career, peaking at 24.2 points per game in 1978, and 18.6 points per game in the playoffs, peaking at 26 points per game in 1983. Mullin averaged a similar 18.2 points per game for his career, peaking at 26.5 points per game in 1989, and 13.8 points per game for the playoffs, peaking at 29.4 points per game in 1989. Both players are known to be offensive dynamos in their prime, carrying their team's scoring load. Davis was more of a mid-range maestro, whereas Mullin could shoot from anywhere on the floor. Both players had 6 seasons of averaging over 20 points per game, but Mullin actually peaked a little bit higher as he had 5 seasons of averaging over 25 points per game, whereas Davis didn't have any 25 plus points per game seasons. However, Mullin also averaged 5 more minutes per game than Davis, so I have a feeling that Davis could have had substantially higher points per game seasons if he played more minutes on average. So overall, I don't think that either player had a substantial advantage over the other here, as both players were lights-out scorers in their primes. So this category will ultimately be a tie. In the rebounding category, both players were solid rebounders in their primes. Davis averaged 3 rebounds a game for his career, peaking at 6 rebounds per game in 1978, and 3.1 rebounds per game in the playoffs, peaking at 8.5 rebounds per game, also in 1978. Mullin averaged 4.1 rebounds per game for his career, peaking at 5.9 rebounds per game in 1989 and 1990, and 3.3 rebounds per game for the playoffs, peaking at 7.3 boards a game in 1991. Although their rebounding numbers look average, in their primes they were actually quite good rebounders. Their numbers are simply dragged down by the fact that Davis only averaged 28 minutes per game for his career, and Mullin spent the later part of his career coming off the bench. Both players had similar peak numbers, but I'll have to give the edge to Mullin for his better consistency. So this one will go to Chris Mullin. In the passing category, both players were also solid passers in their primes as well. Davis averaged 3.8 assists per game for his career, peaking at 5.5 assists per game in 1984, and 4 assists per game in the playoffs, peaking at 6.4 dimes a game in 1984 as well. Mullin averaged 3.5 assists per game for his career, peaking at 5.1 per game in 1989 and 1994, and 2.1 assists per game for the playoffs, peaking at 4.5 assists per game in 1989. Although their career assist numbers look similar, I think Davis was actually the better passer here, as he had higher peak numbers and average numbers despite playing less minutes than Mullin did. Considering he played as a swingman, I think Davis's ability to run the floor as a playmaker might have been underrated, and so this category goes to Walter Davis. In the efficiency and advanced metrics category, both players were quite efficient scorers, with both averaging over 50% field goal percentage for their careers and having quite respectable true shooting percentage as well. But Chris Mullin in particular has very impressive true shooting percentage of 59%, reflecting the fact that he was an elite marksman from anywhere on the floor. Although neither player took any bad shots in general, Davis has a slightly higher PER. I will give this category to Chris Mullin due to his insane efficiency and his overall better shooting abilities. In the defense category, it's a complete wash, as neither player was known to be even average on defense. Both Davis and Mullin were known to be one-way players who focused almost entirely on offense, and their defense being easily the weakest part of their games. The 1980s in particular produced many all-offense, no-defense scoring forwards like Adrian Dantley, Alex English, Bernard King, Dominique Wilkins, Mark Aguirre, and Kiki Vandeweghe, and both Davis and Mullin were no exception to that rule. In the awards category, it's also fairly close, as neither player won any MVPs or championships. Both Davis and Mullin have a similar number of All-Star appearances and All-NBA selections, although Davis has one more All-Star appearance and Mullin has one All-NBA first-team selection. However, neither of these is enough to give each other an edge, so I have to call this category a tie as well. In the playoffs category, it's also a wash, as both players reached 2 conference finals each. Although Mullin reached an NBA Finals with the Indiana Pacers, it was in his second last season and he barely played any minutes for that team that season. So this category will also be a tie. In the longevity category, both players recorded a similar number of points, rebounds, and assists. Mullin has more win shares, but it's not really enough to give him an edge. Both players really have similar longevity totals and played a similar amount of games as well, so this category is also a tie. So when all the categories are summed up, Chris Mullin takes the rebounding and efficiency categories, and Walter Davis takes the passing category, with the rest being a tie, giving Chris Mullin the edge. This really was one of the closest comparison videos, as all but 3 categories ended up in a tie. Chris Mullin is perhaps best known as being a member of the 1992 Dream Team and one of the main superstars of the Run TMC-era Golden State Warriors, alongside fellow Hall of Famers Mitch Richmond and Tim Hardaway. In his prime, he was a fantastic scorer and shooter, and when looking at the numbers in the footage, it's easy to see why he ended up getting picked for the Dream Team. However, he didn't achieve much playoff success until his later days as a role player with the Indiana Pacers. Walter Davis is one of the most underrated superstars ever, as he was the Phoenix Suns franchise player for most of the 1980s, co-starring alongside such all-star teammates as Paul Westphal, Dennis Johnson, Alvin Adams, and Larry Nance. Ended up as the Phoenix Suns' all-time leading scorer, a fact that most NBA fans probably don't really know about. Hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys learned something new. Be sure to like and subscribe and stay tuned for the next comparison video.